And joining me now is a member of the January 6th Select Committee, Democratic Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland. He, of course, was the lead impeachment manager during the second impeachment. Congressman Raskin, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Delighted to be with you.
Let me just start with what you believe were the most important takeaways for these two hearings this past week.
Donald Trump knew the big lie was a big lie. They used it also as a big shakedown and a ripoff of his supporters to keep money rolling in. You know, usually when a campaign's over and someone's lost, it's very difficult to raise money, but they raised more than $200 million based on that lie. Then there's what I'm calling the big joke, the idea that nobody had noticed that for more than 2 centuries, the vice president somehow has the unilateral power to decide who's going to be the next president. And they had invented a new theory with John Eastman and their whole Green Bay sweep that the vice president could step outside of his constitutional role and exercise unilateral extra-constitutional authority just to reject the Electoral College votes sent in by governors representing tens of millions of people. So that was an attempt essentially to use subterfuge and trickery and coercion to overthrow the will of the people. They were trying to steal a presidential election and seize the presidency.
What's your barometer for success for these hearings?
Well, we have to tell the truth to the American people because in a democracy, the people have a right to the truth. That's what it means to be a democracy. Madison said that those who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. And it's a tough knowledge. It's a difficult knowledge, but everybody needs to know. We almost suffered a coup, and we did suffer a violent insurrection on January the 6th.
Is just getting an historical record enough, or does there need to be some justice somewhere?
Yeah, there needs to be accountability, and accountability can mean 2 things. One is individual criminal accountability, that people pay for their particular crimes, as more than 800 people have already been prosecuted for everything from assaulting a federal officer to interfering with a federal proceeding to seditious conspiracy, which means conspiracy to overthrow and put down the government of the United States. But accountability also means collective accountability, and that's the real project that we're engaged in under House Resolution 503, telling the truth to the people so we can make decisions about how to fortify democratic institutions going forward.
President Trump lashed out the committee and lashed out at Vice President Pence just in the last 48 hours. And essentially has not changed his view. He calls Mike Pence weak, says, I think he called him a conveyor belt. This public admission that essentially he wanted continues after laying out all this evidence. Is he confessing?
Yeah, he's essentially saying, yeah, I did it and I'll do it again, which is what we have been contending all along, that if you allow impunity for attempts at unconstitutional seizures of power, which is what a coup is, then you're inviting it again in the future. And to be a strong, self-sustaining, self-respecting democracy, we can't allow people to decide that they are above the law and that they are more important than our constitutional processes.
Do you think every time Donald Trump goes out there and essentially readmits to what he did, what should be the reaction of the Attorney General every time the former president does this?
Well, the Attorney General really shouldn't be reacting to particular provocations by particular politicians or criminals. I mean, that's not really the role of the Attorney General. The role of the Attorney General is to determine, based on the facts and the law, whether there's probable cause to believe that somebody has violated the federal law in the United States, and then to follow the criteria of the Department of Justice. You've got to look at the culpability of the defendant, to what extent they acted willfully to do a criminal act. You've got to look at the gravity and nature of the offense. Of course, this offense has massive implications for the rule of law in America. And you've got to look at deterrence. That is, do we want to move into a system of government where losers in presidential elections can try to overturn the election by nonviolent or violent means?
Given everything you know, if you were in his shoes, do you think this is a close call or not?
I'll leave that judgment to them. I mean, one of the many things that Donald Trump destroyed during his time in office was the idea that the political branches have to respect the independence of the law enforcement function. Right. So that really is up to them. And we're talking about people who are very competent.
You're familiar with the law. You were a constitutional law professor before you got into this job. Yeah. Do you believe that this is a close call for Merrick Garland?
I mean, again, I come back to the culpability of the defendant, the nature of the offense, which I think is extraordinarily grave here. It's hard to think of a more grave offense. And the question of deterrence, and is it important to deter coups and insurrections? And I would say yes, but I think that's as deep as I want to get into the weeds on it.
All right, I want to ask about a couple of things that came up at the hearing that I'd like some clarification on. First, I want to play something that Mr. Jacob, the vice president's then counsel, he described the vice president's refusal to essentially be evacuated by the Secret Service. But there was a specific detail he mentioned that I want to ask you about. Take a listen.
Head of his Secret Service detail, Tim, had said, "I assure you we're not going to drive out of the building without your permission." And the vice president had said something to the effect of, "Tim, I know you, I trust you, but you're not the one behind the wheel."
You had indicated a couple months ago how chilling this was. That felt like a hanging meatball hanging out here. There wasn't a follow-up on this. Why was the vice president concerned that his head of detail wasn't the one behind that wheel?
Well, first of all, I think this was a moment of real courage displayed by Vice President Pence, because what he was saying was, I'm not leaving the Capitol until we count the Electoral College votes as required by the 12th Amendment of the Constitution and the Electoral Count Act. The colloquial phrase, who's behind the wheel, could mean a lot of different things. It could mean, who ultimately is commanding the Secret Service and telling everybody who's behind the,
There was some question. We know that there was an acting deputy chief of staff that was a member of the Secret Service that the president had. I mean, is that where this is going? And do you have any other evidence to indicate that there were real concerns about who the Secret Service, who Pence's detail was listening to?
But I don't want to get into that. To me, it's obviously of interest, and I'm sure it's of interest to Vice President Pence in terms of his own whereabouts and his own movement. But in terms of the big picture, we know that there was an organized hit against our democracy. There was a successful attempt to block the transfer of power, to impede the Congress in the joint session counting electoral college votes, and then the effort to get Pence to declare these absurd powers to unilaterally reject electors. So I think he was wise not to have left the Capitol. None of us wanted to leave the Capitol. And when we were forced out of our chambers, I think that most members, certainly every member of my party, I know Ms. Cheney, most members were saying, we must complete this task tonight.
Are you pursuing this line of investigation more? Is somebody else? Or is this something that you feel like you've gotten everything you can to find out who was in charge of the Secret Service in that moment?
This is not the hearing that I'm going to be conducting. We've sort of divided up the labor, and I'm working on the mobilization of the mob and the domestic violent extremist groups, right, like the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the 3 Percenters, and so on. So that's not a particular detail that I've been following.
Mike Pence a hero?
Well, in a time of absolutely scandalous betrayal of people's oaths of office and crimes being committed all over the place, somebody who does their job and sticks to the law will stand out as a hero on that day. And I think on that day, he was a hero for resisting all of the pressure campaigns and the coercive efforts to get him to play along with this continuation of the big lie, this big joke that he could somehow call off all the proceedings himself. I mean, it likely would have forced everything into the House of Representatives for a so-called contingent election, where the GOP knew that they had a majority of state delegations, because we vote in a 12th Amendment contingent election on the basis of one state, one vote, rather than one member, one vote.
I want to talk about something you keep bringing up before when you're wondering, if we're going to be more investigation, that deterrence has to be a part of the calculation here. I want to get to something, though, that Judge Ludig he talked about the clear and present danger that we are in, and he added this in his testimony. To this very day, the former president, his allies, and supporters pledged that in the presidential election of 2024, if the former president or his anointed successor were to lose that election, that they would attempt to overturn that 2024 election in the same way that they attempted to overturn the 2020 election, but succeed. Is there any change to the law that actually could prevent this, or are we, at the end of the day, you got to hope human beings are going to do the right thing? Can you legislate doing the right thing?
Well, there are a number of reforms to the Electoral Count Act, reforms to the protection of the right to vote, reforms to the electoral process that will dramatically reduce the chances that someone can succeed in trying to impose an exercise of political will over the rule of law. I think you're right that ultimately, if someone has no respect for the rule of law and believes only in their own power in an obsessive, narcissistic way, there's little that can deter that person, but there are things that can fortify us against them. And that is an important part of the committee's work. Perhaps the most important part of it is Judge Ludig was saying. I mean, the Judge Ludig, by the way, he's like Justice Scalia to the conservative right. He's like Robert Bork, and he is out there blowing the whistle saying there's a clear and present danger right now heading into the 2024 elections that Donald Trump and the Trumpist forces will attempt the same kind of maneuver to usurp the will of the people and just declare himself president. That's extraordinary.
You've talked in the last week that you've actually gotten new information. New information seems to come in all the time. Do you have new witnesses? Is it new people or new factual information?
Well, it's both. There are still people who are turning over information to the committee.
We saw new emails that we know from Mr. Eastman that came through. That's clear.
Yeah, and there are people who are just realizing that they are in possession of facts or evidence that the committee might not have. And the chairman has encouraged everybody to come forward. And, we've got a tip line.
Do you have useful information? Has this tip line provided you with actual concrete information that ended up being true, that you've investigated?
We know things this weekend that we didn't know last weekend.
And things that are going to be important facts that we didn't even know either?
Yeah, it's all part of a picture. But again, the general story has been known for a long time. We have a president who, for whatever reason, refused to accept the results of a presidential election and then organized a hit against American democracy through a number of different avenues to try to overthrow the election and install himself as president.
You're part of the investigation. Were sitting members of Congress, do you have evidence that sitting members of Congress helped the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers prepare for the January 6th insurrection?
But I don't want to comment on specific members at this point.
Are there going to be, were members of Congress, but we've seen the release of that tour. Is that does that mean more is to come?
There have been, there are different elements of this hit, and we're discussing all of them. There was, the so-called Green Bay sweep, the attempt to overturn Joe Biden's lawful majority in the Electoral College. There was also a violent street insurrection and insurrectionary violence unleashed against the Capitol. We're going to tell all parts of it, and we're going to invoke the names of everybody relevant who was involved.
Jamie Raskin, member of the January 6th Committee, Democrat from Maryland. Happy Father's Day.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.